Hi. Okay. What we're going to go through today is a very short overview of, first of all, the context behind and the events of the Hungarian uprising. This isn't going to be in enormous amounts of depth, so please, if you are looking into this from perhaps an A-level standard, or if you are wanting to focus on the importance or the significance of the Hungarian uprising, please do investigate sources in more depth. However, for this, our main focus is on really what happened, when did it happen, and how did it transpire. So, before we get into the events of 1956, it's important to have a bit of context as for how we got to this point in the first place. Now, the shadow very much cast over all of Eastern Europe in the 1950s was what had happened in the Second World War. And you can see here, this is an image of soldiers from prisoners of war camp. Of course, Hungary in the Second World War were on the side of the Nazis. So these are welcoming the arrival of the Soviet forces. It was the Russian troops who forced out the Nazis and liberated Hungary and gave Hungary back to the people. Well, not quite. Because what then happens is we have a movement to have free elections in Hungary and in Eastern Europe. In those elections, the Communist Party does not do amazingly well. That doesn't fit with what Russia wanted, however. So instead we get a coalition where communists are prominent within that coalition. And it's no surprise that before long we have a communist backed by the Soviet Union being put in place as the leader of Hungary. And that's the man in the middle, Matthias Rákosi. And Rákosi, as you can tell by the display here, very much is the Soviet Union's man. He describes himself as Stalin's best pupil, and he likens himself to Stalin. Not of comparable figure and intelligence, because he's very much deferential to Stalin, but it's very clear to state that he is going to carry out his rule of Hungary very much in the style in which Stalin is ruling over the Soviet Union, namely limited economic reform, focusing on strict discipline, strict autocratic rule, and limited freedom for the individual people. So this is the situation that Hungary is ruled in, and unsurprisingly, given what we know about Eastern Europe during this time and Soviet communism, it isn't very successful in terms of the quality of life for individuals in the country. So we have very limited consumer goods, we have famine, we have severe economic problems. The turning point, therefore, comes in 1953, when we get the death of Joseph Stalin. Now, very much the cult of Stalin, as it was described, meant that all around Eastern Europe you have mini Stalins in charge and control. So Stalin's death creates a period of unknown. What's going to happen next? How are these countries going to react to the absence now of their ideological leader? So let's have a look, because as you can see, we can trace the Hungarian uprising of 1956 back to 1953. The death of Stalin is fundamentally important to this process, because Rákosi had definitely starred himself as Stalin's disciple. Therefore, with the end of Stalin, it seems unsurprising that we also get the end of Rákosi. So, on Moscow's orders, Rákosi is replaced by a man called Imre Nagy. And we'll see a bit of Imre Nagy here. Here's Imre Nagy. Now, Nagy, however, does, even at this stage, even before the end of 1955, does show an inclination for what we would describe as liberal policies. Some levels of change from the established, the expected way of doing things under Soviet rule. So Nagy gets removed again and replaced by Rákosi. There's no massive backlash against Nagy from those communists Very much he's seen as respected, but just wasn't the right man at that time. And this is very much in the background of increasing seemingly militaristic divisions with the West. NATO, which had been formed in 1949. In 1954, we get the entry into NATO of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, which is very, very significant. It sparks the formation of the Warsaw Pact. So it seems that we are going to be following a very strict totalitarian approach to how Hungary is going to be run. However, we then get a really significant moment for all of Eastern Europe and all of the world, which is the not-so-secret speech of Nikita Khrushchev. Now, between 53 and 56, there's in effect been a battle between men like Beria, like Malenkov, who are in effect competing to replace Stalin. And Khrushchev wins that. He has the backing and he is seen as the new leader of the Soviet Union. And he makes a speech in which he calls out Stalin for what he sees as the errors and of the cruelty that was common under Stalin's regime. And this is absolutely a seismic shift in policy. He calls and begins a process of de-Stalinization, which is the elimination of the influence of Stalin, and very much movements such as the way that the secret police had been behaving in these countries. A secret police is this police force which operates seemingly against the people who are causing problems for the state. So one of the outcomes of Khrushchev's secret speech is Imre Nagy taps into the dissatisfaction in Hungary with Mateusz Rákosi, and with Moscow's support, or more specifically Nikita Khrushchev's support, Imre Nagy is returned to power in Hungary, with Rákosi falling from power. Now, when in power, Imre Nagy embarks on some significant liberal reforms. Now, Imre Nagy is very keen to state that he is a communist, and he isn't calling for the end of communism. He isn't looking for any sort of alliance with the West or seeking closer relations with the United States. But what he does do is embark on a series of reforms. Reforms to the economy, bringing in some elements of market competition, which we might describe as capitalism. Increasing freedom of the press, allowing the press in Hungary to speak out against the regime at times. Freedom of speech, allowing individual people the right to speak out against what is happening and to share their points of view. All things that we would associate with liberal capitalism rather than a strict communist regime. And highly significantly, Imre Nagy puts forward the idea of withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact, taking back independence for Hungary, and certainly Imre Nagy develops a quite close relationship with Tito of Yugoslavia. Now, this is significant because General Tito of Yugoslavia was very much the bête noire, the enemy in many ways of Joseph Stalin, because Tito refused to follow the Soviet policies and ultimately acted as an independent communist state rather than as part of the Eastern Bloc. Crucially as well, as Imre Nagy introduces these more liberal elements, we see a growing rise in pro-democratic, pro-capitalist protests, which are criticising the communist regime. So there seems to be the beginning of a movement towards some form of break from communism, and ultimately a road which it's hoped, certainly by the student protesters, will lead to a more liberal democratic capitalism. Now, in terms of these student protests, we can see things like this, where a statue of Stalin has been dragged through the streets as a demonstration. And the man who is blamed for this, unsurprisingly, is Imre Nagy. So What the Soviet Union need to do, or what they feel they need to do, is to correct this. They could have attempted to use Nagy to instill some level of retraction of his approach, but clearly that isn't going to work. So instead, we get invasion. You can see here, these are tanks and Soviet soldiers re-entering Hungary in a move to take back total control of the country. And that is, in fact, what happens. We have the Soviet invasion, we have the removal of Nagy, we have Nagy being captured, and later he is hung. So he is murdered for his role in this. And as a replacement, we get the Soviet stooge. This is Kadar, who is put in charge. You can see the man on the right there is Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, and Kadar is very much going to operate along whatever lines he is told to by the Soviet Union. During this period, from a Cold War perspective, other than speaking out against Soviet actions and speaking out in support of Imre Nagy, the West don't do anything. They're not willing to risk a war. So in terms of superpower relations, it shows that there is not any inclination here from the West to get involved in the what could be seen as politics of Eastern Europe, despite what had been declared in the Truman Doctrine. So in effect, this brave uprising against sovereign control of Hungary is defeated. It's not a bloodless uprising. There are deaths. There is a forced return to power of a Soviet-friendly government, and Imre Nagy and any ideas of reform is stamped out ruthlessly by the Soviet Union.